Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I'm sure more people will be floating into the webinar to listen. This is the first in a series of informative webinars offered by St. John Associates. The topic in this session will include navigating jobs, searches, and visa processes, including application path, timeline, alternative pathways, and working with an immigration attorney. There will also be a Q&A session at the end, and you will be able to submit your questions, and we'll get to those at the end of the conversation. First, I want to talk a little bit about SJA. Nearly a quarter of the physician workforce is international medical graduates, and SJA is proud to support physicians in all specialties. SJA is a national leader with 33 plus years experience in thoughtful quality matches throughout the United States. As a women-owned firm, SJA serves physicians in all specialties at all stages of their career. First, I would like to introduce Alex St. John, President and CEO of SJA. Welcome, Alex.
Thank you, Kat. I'm really excited to be here today. This is something that we've been really excited to put on. And this is a topic that we discuss a lot internally, and we love helping our visa physicians and those physicians seeking visa sponsorship. We're thrilled that Joe, our expert in this area, could join us. You're going to hear from him in a couple of moments. I'm just going to take a few minutes and talk about who we are as a firm, who St. John Associates is, and what we can do to assist our physicians. So we have been working across the country for over 33 years now and leading a lot of recruiting efforts for all kinds of physicians in every medical specialty. We especially value and have really put a focus on assisting physicians needing visa waivers and visa sponsorship. And we do this across the country. So we work with people who are coming right out of residency and fellowship, placing them in their first job, first position that they're seeking, and then continue to work with them. You know, we have people that are also looking to make later career moves, and we're assisting those physicians as well. We are broken up as a firm by medical specialty. So when you come to work with St. John Associates, you are paired with people who know a deep amount about your specialty and your specific area of practice. They know a ton about the national landscape of jobs that are offered, and also as it relates to physicians seeking visa sponsorship, they know a lot about the layout of that and in which state, what employers are offering sponsorship, what they can provide to you, and really have deep understanding of those employers and those connections. I also want to make note of the fact that searches for physicians, this frequently comes up, but searches for all physicians are free, so our services are free. I like big fan of transparency, and so I like to say that we work on a contingent basis with employers who hire us and who pay us as a firm to find all of you wonderful people and get you all connected with them. So they pay us to bring top talent to them. Our goal in working with all of you is to make your searches as efficient as possible, as easy as possible. So likely if you start your job search, you're speaking with other people, maybe in your program with your co-residents and co-fellows, you're going on job boards, you are kind of diving into it, and it can be incredibly overwhelming. And it can be a tough time to make heads or tails of what's out there in the offerings. And then after that, it's hard to get connected directly with the employers and actually get an interview set up and start the process with them. So we're here to make that really easy for you, get you connected as quickly as possible with the decision makers and with people that we have relationships with them. We have relationships with these employers. We always say the best way to get connected with us is to reach out and work directly with one of our wonderful recruiters. Like I said, they're very skilled, have a lot of experience. Some of them with almost 20 years in their one specialty, recruiting across the country. So they've worked with hundreds and thousands of physicians. The best way is to get in touch with them. They can provide you with all of the current opportunities available and a lot of different support and advice that I'm going to talk about in a second. Another great way to stay connected with us is to go to our website, stjohnjobs.com, and sign up for job alerts. So we get jobs posted really quickly. We've been told by many physicians that we have more opportunities than they're seeing on any other job board. We post those, and if you're signed up for the job alerts, you can get those immediate connections in your email, see the job, see the details, and then start the process of getting connected with those. So switching kind of specifically to visa candidates and what we can provide directly to people who are seeking visa sponsorship out of residency or out of fellowship. We have a very tailored approach with our physicians. So we work with you throughout the entire process. And I think this can be confusing if this is your first time working with a firm. But we are going to start by initially connecting you with employers that you're excited about, ones that you would like to interview with, and we'll stay with you throughout the entire process. So we're going to stay with you through hopefully getting those made offers, through your licensing, through the visa application process the employer is going through, making sure there are no loose ends, there's no information that's not being shared, and that you are really kept in the loop, and that your questions throughout the process are answered thoroughly and quickly. We initially, when we're going to talk to you on the phone, we're going to ask you what you're looking for in a role. We're going to say, where do you want to be? What's important to you, to your family? What do you want out of a practice environment? All of the different factors that are going to start to shape your search and how we're going to assist you. And then also, what are your specific visa needs? So are you applying for a waiver through the Conrad 30 program? Are you past that and you're an H-1B and have different considerations? Are you looking for an O-1 waiver? We're going to start to really get into that with you and understand how we can help you in your search. We will focus on providing you advice on your CV. So, how can we tweak your CV a little bit to make it look better? We review thousands of CVs every year, and so we have a lot of information about what is helpful and what is not. Interview prep. So we're going to be spending a lot of time getting you ready for your interviews with maybe you're interviewing with a large hospital system and talking to their in-house recruiting team. Maybe you are starting with a few private practices. Anything in between, we're going to make sure that you have all the information about the job and feel confident going into that step of the process. And then anything else that comes up. There's not a lot that we haven't seen. We work with so many physicians who have immigration considerations, and we work in every specialty. So we really have seen it all, and our recruiters that you work with understand all the nuances and can help you with, my child needs this, so we need to consider this certain facet in our search. Or I really, I've heard this and I'm pretty concerned and I want to make sure this doesn't exist in a practice setting. Or here are my compensation parameters, or fill in the blank. We've seen it, we've dealt with it, and we are really going to be happy to partner with you and get in there and help. And the other thing that we do, and I always want to make sure we have time to talk about this, but when you are applying online, when you are applying through a job board, or when you reach out directly, what we see happen all the time is your CV, your information, your email is getting caught in a queue of dozens or hundreds of people applying for the same role. A big value in working with a firm is we have a direct relationship. We partner directly with the employers, And so your CV, your information, is getting to the front of that group of people, and we're getting you in touch with the employer. Sometimes that same day, usually that week, and making sure that you start the process. So you're going to stay on track with the timeline that you've set for yourself. We're going to make sure that you do not fall behind in the visa process or the visa timeline, and we're going to make sure that you can start to get engaged with the employer so you can be a really competitive candidate in the search for a position. We have lots of jobs that we represent that are not listed on job boards. Lots of jobs that we are the only recruiting firm working with this employer. And they count on us to really manage a lot of that piece of the process for them. So when you're out looking and you're trying to pull together this compilation of all of the jobs you're seeing listed on job boards, on hospital websites, on practice websites, it's overwhelming, and we can really cut through that for you and assist with that piece of the process. We keep the search going, and it takes a lot of the time off of you too. It's a very time-consuming process, so we get that feedback a lot. I want to just close here by briefly saying that we love working with visa candidates. This has been something that we focus on, we love to do, we are honored to do, and we are always advocating for both our visa candidates and also helping educate our employers on how they can do more sponsorship, on how they can continue to expand their offerings for all of you job-seeking physicians. And we work with a lot of real-time information and are very plugged in nationally with the ever-changing landscape of the immigration layout for physicians in the United States, and working with the absolute best attorneys that we can send you all to that can also assist in the process. So with that, I want to just give a quick plug for Joe, who's going to talk in a couple of minutes. We've had a lot of our wonderful physicians work with him and his firm, and we've heard really great things about the advice that he has given, his responsiveness, his willingness to help, and I'm excited to hear what he has to say. So back to you, Kat.
Thank you so much, Alex. Thank you for that wonderful overview of SJA. Next, I would like to introduce Joe Fuschetto, who is got a ton of experience working in this arena. Joe is an immigration attorney in Bloomington, Indiana at Bunger and Robertson. He represents corporate and individual clients in several areas of immigration law with a focus on filings for physicians, academics, and professionals. He has extensive experience in J-1 waivers, H-1B petitions, and petitions for aliens of extraordinary ability, employment-based green card applications, and other immigration filings. His expertise has allowed him to represent some of the largest employers in the country, as well as immigrants of limited means. He presents on immigration topics at a number of conferences and local events, universities, and for private employers. Joe also is an active member of the American Immigration Lawyers Association and the International Medical Graduate Task Force. Welcome, Joe. Could you please walk us through the very extensive application timeline process? The floor is yours.
Absolutely. Thank you for that introduction, Catherine, and Alex as well. I will walk you through first the basics, which you guys all probably know about how to get residency or fellowship sponsorship. And we'll get into different types of waivers as required, or continuing on with H-1B sponsorship, and then discuss green cards briefly. I do have to state, I've spent over a decade in the field. I've taught courses in immigration law. It gets very, very complex, and I'm trying to keep this all under about half an hour. So it is a lot of details that I'll try to get the important ones to you, but do not hesitate. We have some time at the end to ask questions. And if there are things that need to be more in depth, then that's something we can deal with for your individual process. But as a general rule, and as most of you know, you generally come to do your postgraduate training in either a J1 or an H1B. The J1 is technically an exchange visitor's visa. It's all sponsored through the Educational Commission on Foreign Medical Graduates, or ECFMG, and you generally can have it up for 7 years, and you can extend past that for certain fellowships in that J1. But importantly, when the J1, well, in the 1960s and 70s, when Congress was deciding how to protect U.S. national medical graduates, they said, well, we'll bring in foreign medical graduates who'll have to be on a J visa. And the incentive there was on a J visa, you had to return to your country of legal permanent residence for 2 years before you could obtain either work authorization or a green card. And so they said this will be a way that we can bring in residents and fellows, but they won't necessarily be competing for U.S. jobs afterwards. Well, that was in the 1960s and 70s and early 80s. Come to the 1990s, and we realized there's a physician shortage that's only grown exponentially since the 1990s. And so Congress has enacted waiver programs, which we'll discuss here, to allow those international medical graduates who are trained in the U.S. to then stay in the U.S. after completion. Okay. So that is one thing. Second thing, in the 1990s, they enacted the H-1B program, which was a non-immigrant worker program for professionals. And this allowed individuals to stay in the U.S. for up to 6 years, often while going through a green card. However, it also opened up the possibility for individuals in their residency program or fellowship program to do that on an H-1B rather than a J. And this enabled those individuals to not have to get a waiver, which is a benefit in the long run of things, after they complete their postgraduate medical training. However, it comes with its own pitfalls. So we're kind of talk about, well, what's the difference there? Now, about 65% of all international medical graduates, they're going to be in a J for their training, and they can have one immigration path, which we'll talk about. And then about 35%, they're going to be an H for their medical training, and they have a different path, which we'll kind of go on. So we'll first going to discuss that waiver path and what that will look like for the J individuals, which are the majority, and what goes on there. Next slide, please. Sorry. All right. We'll get the next slide up, I think. And then J, as discussed, most popular. Prior to going into it, you have to have your USMLE 1 and 2 complete. Normally, you'll complete your 3 somewhere during your residency program. Afterwards, you are looking for a waiver program. We're going to discuss the Conrad 30 program, which is the biggest of the programs. We'll get into there into detail. And then we'll also discuss some of what we call the regional center programs. And then we're going to later discuss that H-1B, sponsored by the medical employer, requires that step 3. If your residency is done in H, you don't have to obtain the waiver, which is the big push there. And then finally, if we have some time left over, we'll talk a little about the O1, which is a very viable path. I know a lot of you are in residency or fellowship and view the O1 because it's labeled as a visa that's available for an international or for a non-citizen of extraordinary ability, that you guys view that as something out of your reach. I will say very, very clearly that is absolutely not true. We file O1s for residency physicians and fellowship physicians regularly with approvals. Okay. So after that, we're now in, let's just kick it off with the J1 waivers, which is going to be what most of you will be looking forward going forward. I'm going to start first with the Conrad 30 program. It is named after Kent Conrad. He was a senator from South Dakota, and it was originally actually the Conrad 20. And what this program did, it is allowed each state through their state health department to select 30 physicians who are international medical graduates. So they have their medical degree from abroad and they don't have U.S. citizenship. It allowed each state, to originally 20, now 30 per year, to agree to work in a medically underserved area for 3 years. And at the end of that 3-year period, that foreign national graduate is able to apply for a green card. And we'll talk about the different green card paths, but the idea here is rather than go back to your country of last legal permanent residency for 2 years, due to a provision known as 212E, you get the opportunity to work in a medically underserved area for 3 years. And then after that, you can proceed in your immigration process and eventually get a green card. It also allows for you to immediately file your H-1B once the waiver is issued. So what this commonly looks like is you're, let's say, a family medicine physician in Nebraska, and you find a clinic that wants to support your immigration needs. You go, they give you a job offer, they're in a medically underserved area. You collect a lot of paperwork, as well as some evidence about yourself, about the clinic, about the nature of the medically underserved area. And then you apply to the Nebraska Department of Health. They issue a waiver. You then get that waiver and you can file for an H that gives you 3 years to work. After you're done with that 3 years, your employer or yourself through various programs can go about getting a green card. And so that's kind of the traditional physician immigration pathway. And again, about 65% of you will go through that pathway in one way or another. Okay. Now, having said that, one of the things about the Conrad 30 is it follows federalism principles, or what we sometimes call the laboratory of democracy. So every state has different rules, and that is just across the board. Every state has slightly different Conrad 30 rules. They have general trends. I can tell you the general trend, particularly in recent years, is that states are awarding priority for those with a higher HPSA score, which is a health professional shortage area score. Some states still go by first come, first serve. Some states don't fill. So these are states often not perceived as the most desirable. Wyoming, Alaska, Vermont. They just have low populations, because remember, this is a program that was championed by a senator. In the US, every state gets 2 senators, regardless of their population. So when you have 30 physicians per state, and you have California with a population of 68 million, and Wyoming with a population of about 400,000, the ability to fill their waiver spots is very different. And also, it means as a attending applicant to any one of these programs, you have to understand that states with bigger populations, which are often seen as more desirable by International Medical Graduate Task Force, may have higher standards to obtain a waiver through their program. So there is a little bit of a compromise, and that's built into the system at some level too. And what I mean by that is the point of the Conrad 30 program to begin with is to deliver healthcare services to Americans who otherwise wouldn't be obtaining healthcare services. So by the fact that you incentivize and it makes it somewhat unpopular, it's frankly unfair at some level to the International Medical Graduates Task Force, but the system in and of itself is designed that way. That if you were a US citizen graduate, there would be maybe a broader field of jobs and roles to apply for. So I do talk about that. However, and this is something to look for, because this may be a word that gets thrown around when you talk to friends or those who have gone through the program before, I always mention flex waivers. So what a flex waiver is for certain states that maybe weren't filling in their medically underserved areas, or sometimes they just don't have many medically underserved areas, particularly on the East Coast. There are states that don't have the full brunt of the physician shortage like some other states. So they allow for flex waivers. And what flex waivers are is that your work site doesn't necessarily have to be in a medically underserved area, but you have to convince that state Department of Health that you serve a majority, 51% in most instances, but it varies by state, 51% medically underserved patients. And so flex waivers are a very popular resource and option for individuals and clinics that may not be in an HPSA or a medically underserved area, but they can use the flex waiver provisions to recruit a Conrad 30 waiver. So yeah, that is what I'll say about Conrad 30s. Because they are very broad, you really have to study each program. States have different regulations. Some are considered more difficult. Some are considered less difficult, often mirroring population as discussed. But I do encourage you, if you're interested in a state, to really explore that waiver program and kind of know what the rules are coming in. Farther down the line, for those of you in your early years of residency or fellowship, there are likely to be some changes. I'm a member, one of my other hats I wear, I'm in some lobbying groups that push for change at the federal level. So there's been a push, bipartisan even, to increase the number of waivers, because increasingly states are filling their 30 waivers per year. And the issue with filling that is Congress hasn't agreed to increase that cap, because they could easily increase it. There's a bill in Congress to actually increase it to the Conrad 100. That one's a little less likely to pass. Then there's a bill in Congress that would increase it by state need. And that one's gotten a lot of bipartisan support. But I would not hold my breath for it, because I have been telling new applicants that for many years, and it hasn't come to fruition yet. But I do have some hope and faith left in the electoral process that Congress will pass a law that helps not only the hospitals, but also the international medical graduates who are in their residency and fellowship program. Apart from the Conrad 30 program, which is state specific, there are a number of federal programs. And the biggest one being HHS, or Health and Human Services. And this is open. It's a great program if you are a primary care physician or hospitalist. So it has some additional rules. And generally, it requires that you work in a medically underserved area with an HPSA score of 7 or above, and that you're in primary care or a hospitalist, and you haven't been out of residency for more than a year. So that's the confines of the program. There's some additional requirements that the employer will have to meet, such as using a sliding fee scale and some other things. But that is the general confines of the HHS program. I do endorse it, and I'll tell you why, is because I endorse it across the board, and I can't be enough. Number one, Mike Berry is a saint. He's the man who actually runs the program, and he is very easy to work with, more so than most of the state departments of health. And he's taken upon himself to champion increased enrollments in the Health and Human Services program. So it used to be a program that sponsored about 70 to 80 waivers a year. Last time Mike gave a presentation at one of the attorney bar association groups I was with, they were sponsoring over 600 waivers a year. And they weren't even done with the fiscal year yet. So since COVID, he's really taken on himself to advertise, champion, and expand the program as much as they can. And it is great because it works a little faster and it's a little more streamlined than some of the state ones. So if you are a hospitalist or primary care, I really often will push towards HHS if available. And then the other benefit, just as an American and with relatives that are sometimes needing to see a doctor, HHS doesn't cut into that 30 cap. It is uncapped. So if you get an HHS waiver, that often means an oncologist gets to go work in a medically underserved area in your state. And while it may be a fairly minor benefit, it is good for the state and humanity general when people have doctors. So oftentimes, if you're a primary care hospitalist, I'll say, let's look to HHS. It'll come in a little quicker. It'll be a little more streamlined. And you're going to help someone you don't even know get their own waiver, because they're going to be a specialist and they're not going to be able to obtain an HHS waiver. So I often kind of, and again, that's just my humanitarianism, but that probably doesn't matter too much to you individually. And then on top of that, there are a number of other programs. These are all geographically based and they are expanding. So the long-term ones are the Delta Regional Authority and the Appalachian Regional Commission. These are what we call regional centers, and they each have different needs. And what they try to do is really expand medical access in those areas. Okay. They have different rules. What we have seen since COVID, there's actually a COVID budget bill that enabled the establishment of more regional centers, has been an addition. So we now have, it's actually one of the biggest programs now, the Southeast Crescent Regional Commission. So this covers Georgia and Florida and the Carolinas. We also see the Great Plains Regional Commission. I'm on a committee that helps to go through their Conrad 30 programs and regulations. Those are coming out soon, and that covers a lot of the Great Plains area. The new one on the horizon, which I've been somewhat involved with, but it's not as big as I would like in Indiana, I'm just going to be honest with you, is the Great Lakes Regional Commission. They're coming out with a J1 waiver program, but it just covers the Great Lakes watershed, which doesn't cover as far into Indiana as I thought. So my Indiana public education failed me in my knowledge of the Great Lakes watershed. But at any rate, those waiver programs are great because they're uncapped. A lot of them will take specialists. So this is another idea. If you come out, you're not eligible for HHS, you want to go into a state, say, for example, Florida is one where specialists can be hard, real hard to get through a specialist with the 30 Conrad 30 program. But the Southeast Crescent Regional Commission has some programs for you, depending on the place in Florida. So we also look to those when we're trying to fill hard to compete states. And so that's kind of where we're at. And then, some common attributes, and I think I kind of went over this, but I'll restate it again. So on all these waiver programs, you got to be NJ, you get your waiver. Afterwards, you're going to convert, normally in the US, but some countries will send you abroad, and I'll kind of explain some of that. You'll convert to an H-1B. You'll have to do 3 years in a medically underserved area, depending on the program, under the rules of that program. And then afterwards, you're eligible to finalize or have a green card be received, okay? I should explain, and we'll talk a little bit more about green cards because this is a question that gets asked. You can start some of the green card process while you're in your Conrad 30 or HHS service, but you can't generally have the green card issued until after your service is complete, okay? So this is one of the standard. You can do most of the process, and I highly recommend you do, because otherwise you're going to be waiting an additional 3 years after you do your 3 years of service to get your green card, but you can't finalize the process until you've done your 3 years of waiver, okay? One other thing about these waivers, and you may hear this sometimes even from employers, that you can't leave the job while you're on your waiver. That's not entirely true. Okay, you have to show that for reasons beyond your control that you could no longer complete your waiver service. Okay, and well, what does that mean? It's complicated. It depends a little bit on the situation. If your employer shuts down, if your hospital facility shuts down, generally that's excused and you can move on to a new employer in a new medically underserved area. Okay. There are a lot more tricky scenarios that we've dealt with, sometimes successfully, sometimes not. And so what that'll happen is, for example, you have a hostile work environment. Is that going to allow you to switch? Maybe, if we can show that the employer failed to uphold their obligations under the waiver program, sometimes that allows you to move. Hopefully we're not in that situation, but that does happen. Sometimes we've dealt with more individual family issues, a dependent, a child, or a spouse need a particular type of medical care, not available in your work area, so you have to move across the country. Can you be excused from your waiver? Yeah, but you have to make a pretty convincing case that it's not just something you made up. So it's up to USCIS and the Department of Homeland Security to decide whether your cause to terminate the waiver service is sufficient and beyond your control. So it's a high standard, but not impossible. And I just always like to say, because I think at this point, I don't represent any of you and I don't represent any employer in any of this transaction. I think sometimes it gets lost because the employer just wants to tell you can't leave. And that's not entirely true. It's just a little more complicated than if you were a US citizen physician. So next we're moving on, just some details on the H-1, because what happens is you may be on an H-1 visa right now. You may be in your residency or fellowship program, going through your H-1B visa, and there's a certain issue with that. But even if you're on J, if you want to fulfill your waiver, you have to fulfill that medically underserved 3 years of service in an H-1B. So it is important that you understand and familiarize yourself with the H-1B program generally. Okay, so the biggest issue, if you're doing your medical training on an H, is that you have enough time on your 6 years of H-1B to file a green card with your new employer. So this happens all the time, particularly for specialists, oncologists, pulmonologists. It is a big issue because their training takes 6 years often, 7 years occasionally with a fellowship. And so what happens there is you can't complete it all in an H. Now, there are some ways. So you can expand your H status past the 6 year mark as long as you file an I-140 or a PERM application with a year left in your 6 years total. And I know that sounds really confusing, so I'll try to break it down again. But you have 6 years in H-1B as long as you are far enough along in your green card process that you have filed an I-140 or a PERM with a year left. So prior to that 5 year anniversary, then you can extend your H past the 6 year. Well, how far can you extend it? Generally in year increments until your I-140 is current, which we'll talk a little bit about priority dates, but it depends upon your country of birth. Most countries are going to be current within 2 to 3 years of their H-1B or their I-140 or 9089 filing. India is going to be somewhere between 40 to 140 years, and China is going to be current in about 5 years. So other than those countries, everyone else is about 2 to 3 years. It has to do with diversity provisions of the INA that show that, or that state that no more than 7.5% of individuals can come from any one country in any one category. And given the high population of India and China and the high population of professionals from those countries, it has pushed back the priority date. So there's a long line for green cards for those countries. But I say that in the context of, if you're in H-1B now and you're doing your residency, and about 30% of you are, if you're doing a fellowship, you need to make plans to prepare to have an I-140 approved prior to year 5. And so that will often, unlike some of the J's who can push off until the last year or two of training, and then you start to worry about waivers, when you're on an H, this decision comes a little bit quickly, because if you don't do it in time, you end up to be in a position where you can't start your job and you have to go abroad for a year and come back. Okay. So other than that, H-1B is more generally for professionals. You may hear about an H-1B lottery. It is very rare. So this is an H-1B lottery. Congress has allotted 85,000 H-1Bs per year. It is very rare that you guys will have to deal with an H-1B lottery. It can happen for physicians. I've done hundreds of physician filings. I think I've dealt with it twice. And the reason that is twofold. One is that any of the waiver, so Conrad 30, HHS, VA, all the waiver programs, once your waiver is approved, you have a cap exempt H-1B for your entire life, which means you never have to go against the H-1B lottery. So that's as part of the waiver, that is a benefit given to you, because what they don't want is to provide a waiver to work in a medically underserved area and then not allow for the physician to actually provide services to medically underserved Americans. So they said, we're going to cap exempt that. Okay. Well, when do you have to deal with it? This is a smaller subset. So this is generally if you've done your training in H-1B and then you want to go to a for-profit employer. A lot of the larger practice groups, so we're talking, University of Michigan Health, University of Texas Health, they are going to be cap exempt nonprofits. So that means they're a nonprofit employer, and because of their relationship with the university, they do not have to file under the H-1B lottery. They can directly file for H-1Bs. There's a provision of the H-1B regulations that gives incentives to universities and university-affiliated nonprofits that allows them to file H-1Bs without going through a lottery. And so most of the large teaching hospitals are. However, if you're on H in your training and then you want to go work for John and Sarah Medical Practice, PC, well, they aren't going to be a cap exempt nonprofit, so you're going to have to go against that H-1B lottery, and that can be a difficulty. So often if you do your training in H, I suggest you gear your job search towards larger hospital groups, spend your 3 years, and then after that, you can go, once you give your green card, go elsewhere. If you're in a J1 position and you're going to get a cap exempt H-1B, you can directly go work for that private practice or that smaller specialty practice. A few other things. Once you're on that H, if your job changes, you sometimes have to file an amendment. Those are generally very approvable. And if your I-140 is approved, which we'll talk a little bit about, but I'm realizing we're getting close to time and we got a lot of questions piled up. If you have your I-140 approved, you're going to be able to, your spouse is going to be able to work on an H-4. And so that does generally happen. And if you're prudent about the timing on it, it can happen even when you start working. So we're going to then talk about the O-1 visa approach. And so I think we have the O-1 slide coming up. And so on that O-1 visa, O actually stands for outstanding. This is sometimes referred to as the alien of extraordinary ability or the non-citizen of extraordinary ability, or the Einstein visa or the Lino Messi visa. It is a discretionary visa. So unlike the H, where there are certain criteria you meet, and then once you meet those criteria, you're approved, the O-1 is a little more art than science at times, although there's parts to it where you have to meet 3 of 8 criteria. Most physicians coming out of residency are going to meet 2 of these, if not 3 of these, pretty quickly. So the ones we generally talk about of the 3 criteria you have to meet, one of them is that you have to have a publication. And I've yet to meet a physician that doesn't have something in a peer-reviewed journal during the residency or fellowship. A second one is you're going to have a receipt or award of lesser national influence that involves funding. And so this is generally your fellowship or residency. So that residency or fellowship, we make the argument that that's an award or a grant because they're funding your fellowship and residency for training. And it's thousands, hundreds of thousands in most cases of dollars the hospital is paying on the back end for your training. Obviously, you're providing services for them, but they generally meet that. And then the third one I often recommend all of you do for two reasons. One, they need it. And number two, it really does help with an O1, is become a peer reviewer. So if you peer review a journal article, it is one of the three criteria to meet it. So you've been asked to be a judge of the work of others, and it is almost impossible to be denied a peer review request because the journals always want peer reviewers. So you just ask a journal. If your field is surgical oncology, you ask the Journal of Surgical Oncology, do you need a peer reviewer? And they will almost assuredly say yes, yes, please, because we have a hard time recruiting enough. So I often recommend that, even if you don't think you'll need the O1, to do it. So let's talk about when you do need the O1. Well, the number one time I file O1s is when an individual got kicked out did not succeed in their waiver program. So not kicked out, but oftentimes they don't meet the 30. Some of these waivers in competitive states can have far more than 30 applicants. And you may not know that until further into your process. So you may have signed a contract in June. You may have learned in February that you are not going to get a waiver. And then you say, well, I'm done with my fellowship in June 30th. What do I do? Well, the O1 is the answer. We do an O1. You generally can get that obtained. You go abroad and then you come back and work on the O and then go and find a new waiver. Okay. And that is very strongly my suggestion for individuals in that state. And that's when they come up. Now, they come up other times. Sometimes we have physicians that don't want to work in the US or had other plans to go abroad for a while, changed their plans and said, let's file an O. Sometimes we do have foreign physicians that you can actually obtain an O sometimes without a residency or fellowship, depending upon state licensure, but they're famous in their own country and they come for certain research. We file O's, but most of the time it's when individuals did not have a successful waiver and they need something that allows them to work or allows them to come back after they're done with their training. Importantly, though, for that, it does not count towards that J1 service requirement. So that 3 years of medically underserved work you have to do an H status. And so that O doesn't qualify you for it. All right. And then permanent residency, and I do apologize, I don't have too much time here, and I'd love to talk to you all day, but permanent residency is the end goal for all of this. This is a pathway to citizenship. So unlike the O or the H or any other processes we've talked about today, really permanent residency is kind of the end of this, the end goal. And then once you have permanent residency, you have 5 years generally, and then you're eligible to naturalize and become a US citizen. I touched on this before, and priority dates are a little confusing, but the idea is a priority date is your date and your place in line. And you generally get a place in line for permanent residency with either the date you file your labor certification, also known as a PERM, which is after your employer conducts recruitment and shows there's no US citizens while you're able to do your job. Or if you do an NIW or PNIW, you file an I-140, and that's your place in line. And that place in line, every month, the US State Department publishes something called a visa bulletin, and they tell you what case they're processing. So for example, now, for rest of the world, so this would be, say, for example, Brazil, that they are processing cases with an I-140 filed prior to November 2023. Okay, so that's about 2 years, 18 months. There's always a little bit of change in that. For an Indian national, they'd be processing a case for October 2011. So it means about a 14-year backlog, and then you actually add on a lot higher to that because of the way these things roll down. So that's your priority date. And so it's important to know how long the actual green card is going to take. And you can actually do the I-140 and the labor certification while you're still in your Conrad 30 period, but you can't file that second part, the 485, until you've completed your Conrad 30 service or your HHS service or any of the other J1 services we talked about. There are a few programs here. So one that I'm always a big fan of, and as the priority dates go longer and longer, I'm a stronger advocate of the Physician National Interest Waiver. The Physician National Interest Waiver, or the PNIW, is a specialty program for physicians to provide green cards. It essentially, in most states, and you do have to check on your state, it adds 2 years to your Conrad 30 service. And what I mean by that is if you do 5 years in a medically underserved area, you get your green card at the end of it. Now, it still has priority date wait. So if you're an Indian or Chinese national, there's a longer wait there. But few benefits of the PNIW. One, you get your priority date almost immediately. So as soon as you file your PNIW, you get your priority date, and that's your place in line, and it's going to be 2 or 3 years. Okay. You can file a 485, which allows your spouse to work while the case is pending during your Conrad 30 service. None of the other programs allow that. All the other programs say during your Conrad 30 service, you can't file a 485. I like them for Indian and Chinese born physicians the most because it gets their place in line earlier. If we do a labor certification, it's going to be 2 or 3 years before you get your place in line. While a PNIW can be 2 or 3 months. And as an Indian or a Chinese national, because of the way priority dates work, you're going to be waiting a long time. For other physicians, increasingly, and particularly under this administration, processing times have gone up enough at the labor certification and PERM that the 5 years is not too far off the realistic time it takes to get a green card to begin with. So I've started to push for PNIWs on a lot. PERM is the traditional path. This is not just employment-based. This is for all professions. Your employer will have to go through and recruit for your job. It can be highly technical, and it does take a long time, currently about 2 to 3 years. However, for most physicians not born in India or China, it's going to be the quicker way to go about all of this, okay? We have a quick slide here, and some of this we'll talk just about documentation needed. All of it is what I generally tell people when they talk about what they need. But what I mean by that is often your DS 2019s, if you have an H-1B, your prior 797s, your ECFMG certs, your USMLE scores, often letters of recommendation, and then current CV, passports, if you have dependents, marriage license, birth certificates for dependent children. And then finally, just because I know we're running out of time and I want to save this last few minutes for questionnaires, we'll talk a little bit about these. We've already talked about some. One of the big questions I get, though, that I'll just highlight now is essentially a question. Visa stamping, particularly under this administration, has been a challenge. So I've been advising that if you can avoid visa stamping or going abroad to get your visa, we try to find a pathway that does that. And oftentimes it may mean extending your underlying J1 to have a board certification, but it is a tricky path. The other one that has been going on is just increased PERM processing times, mean that the PNIW looks a lot more attractive than it did in the past. And then on top of that, I'll go through a little slide, working with immigration attorneys. I've worked both sides of the aisle, so to speak. In fact, most of the time I'm representing the employer. And you know, this question comes up often. Should I hire my own attorney? It's up to you. Attorneys aren't free. In the absence of money, I would say everyone needs an attorney all the time, including attorneys. But we live in the real world where money is an issue. You know, and it depends a little bit upon the nature of the employer as well. Large healthcare groups, they have often dealt with the process dozens, if not hundreds of times, large hospital-based practices, and they have kind of a standard way. They often will have their either an in-house attorney or someone like me. I work with a few different hospital groups, and I've worked with the same groups for years or decades at this point, and I know their whole system in and out. And so it can be hard to bring in someone new. Sometimes smaller groups, they may have never worked with an attorney, they don't know. The other one is there's a difference between an immigration attorney like myself and a contract attorney. Some do both, but I generally say get a contract attorney and then get a immigration attorney, and generally it's a different skill set, just like an oncologist and a nephrologist are a different skill set. So I would say get both, look for your contract employee first. Sometimes you may need an immigration attorney just to review what their immigration attorney wrote in the contract. And I think that's mainly it, except for a Q&A session. So I know we have a few in the chat that I will.
Thank you, Joe. That was awesome. I know that was a quick rundown, but appreciate all that fabulous information. I just opened up the Q&A chat. We'll start at the top. If one does a general psych residency and then a 2-year child psych fellowship, are they eligible for an HHS pathway or a Conrad 30 due to their fellowship being 2 years?
I've dealt with this issue. Unfortunately, as far as I know, and what Mike Berry would say, because it's in the HHS regulation, is you have to have completed your residency program within a year. So the fact that the childhood psychology is a 2-year program, you aren't going to be eligible for an HHS. Some Conrad 30 programs may treat you as a primary care. I've dealt with that on a few states where child psychology or adolescent psychology, because it's generally a shorter program, they'll treat as primary care, particularly if it's in an outpatient setting. But yeah, you're likely going to have to do a Conrad 30 for that. I think we got a question on email of a recruiter. Another email of a recruiter.
Right. There's one regarding, I believe it's Laura. I'm a Colombian hematologist and clinical oncologist specialist, green card holder. At the end there, could you help me with the process to apply for restricted license under the requirements of these laws?
Oh, okay. Yeah, so this has actually been a new rise. This has been at a state-by-state level. This has been a new rise. So her case is a little bit different, which is interesting. So she already has a green card coming in, so you don't have to go through that traditional J or waiver to H-1B pathway. You're treated essentially as a U.S. citizen would be. However, it looks like she did her training abroad. Well, there's been an increase in states because of the physician shortage, loosening the requirements. It used to be across all 50 states, you had to do your residency and fellowship training in the U.S. It just was. And sometimes it's even sad. We bring in, a world-class surgeon from the UK, and it would be, okay, go be a first-year surgical resident, and it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Well, what states have done, and really New York has done this for a while. They've been the pioneer of it, almost 30 years, I think, and that has to do with their proximity to Canada, is my understanding, and how many Canadian physicians they were getting. But what states have done is loosen those requirements. So it varies by state. I actually testified in an Indiana congressional session about this, and they didn't take most of my recommendations because I was saying you could loosen them quite a bit, and they didn't listen to that. But it does vary by state what they require. So I think St. John's can look at some of that. If that's the question, apply for those. I can tell you some of the big states. New York, they've done it for a while. It varies by where your medical school was. If the medical school is on an ABA or an AMA list, there's also an AGCME list about certain medical schools. It then matters the amount of training. Some states will only exempt a residency and not a fellowship. Some states will do a fellowship. Another big one that has the more expansive is Virginia. Virginia enacted one, I think, about 2 years ago. I've been successful in placing a few specialists in Virginia, and that'd probably be my first guess on where I would look around. But there's actually a number of states, and there's actually a nonprofit group that has been publishing some of this information on a state-by-state comparison. So yeah, there are options there. You may, on many states, have to redo the fellowship, but not the residency.
Okay.
All right.
We have a critical care professional asking about options for a limited license in a university.
So that can come from a critical care professor. This is a few things. So ECFMG certification, this will depend upon what the university filed you under. So there's something called an SOC code, assuming you're on an H-1B. There's an SOC code. If they filed you, which they likely did, under a health teaching professional, you have a limited amount of what you can actually perform outside of the classroom. And that has to do with the H-1B being a different code. Normally, it's much higher on the wages. So the H-1Bs have a wage requirement that you pay more than the minimum for that profession. And normally the teachers have a lower salary. And so then you're limited from providing direct patient care. And so it really depends, though, upon what your university filed. And my first suggestion with them would be have a discussion. If they say, oh, we just filed for you as a teacher and you can't do any direct patient care, let them know and go from there. Ask for another one. There are universities that will pay you more, pay you as a provider and allow you more expanded care, almost certainly. But you may be in a situation right now where you're just a professor and you're limited from some of that.
Okay. Seems like our list is jumping around here.
Okay.
Okay. Hello, I've applied for a family green card. I already applied for a family green card. Not
Will it
yet.
affect my application?
No.
Generally not. It depends on where you're at in the stage. Now, if you have a J1 and you are subject to the 212E, when you say green card, it would depend upon the status. But any type of green card that's family-based, you're going to be subject to what we call the 212E, which is that 2-year requirement. So you'd have to actually get a waiver, and you'd have to do 3 years before they could complete the green card application. It's kind of a technical question. You have to see where you're at. You can generally file the I-130, which is the petition connected to a family-based green card, but you can't file the 485 until you've completed your 3 years of medical service. If you're on an H, or sorry, if you're on a J, if you're on an H, none of that applies. You can directly apply for the green card, and it's a dual intent.
Okay.
I'm a family medicine physician in Mexico. I understand I must complete the ECFMG certification to apply for a visa. Is there only for doctors who graduate? Yes. No, you do have to complete the ECFMG certification. You likely have to match or find sponsorship. You may be able to avoid that through going to states that don't require that residency program, but then they're going to have to directly file for the H-1B, which can be tricky. So most of the time, you're going to have to go into a residency program. You may be able to find a state that'll accept you without the residency program and then apply from there.
Okay.
Oh, we skipped a question. Thank you.
Okay.
Hello, I'm a psychiatry resident. I was wondering if HHS/regional centers would be a good option for me instead of Conrad 30. Yeah, although most states, and we didn't talk about this in Conrad 30s, most states give preference to primary care, and a lot of states will consider general psychology primary care, particularly if it's outpatient. Some states have a restriction if you want to do inpatient psychology, which is a whole kind of different world. But so look on the states. You're probably in a good position in general, just being a psychiatry resident, because most states will accept you as a primary care, and most primary care for Conrad 30s get approved. You'll certainly have some regional center and HHS options as well. So you're in a good place. It can be a lot harder if you've done a fellowship, or like the 2-year adolescent or child psychology can kind of limit some of those options. Did that. Quick question. What are the differences or potential challenges between applying for a J1 waiver in the US versus returning to your home country? You can return to your home country and just be out of the country for 2 years rather than go through the waiver process and come back on an H. I would say the biggest challenge there is finding an employer to hire you when you're not in the US, you've been abroad for 2 years. They don't know, depending upon your home country, what the level of medicine you've been practicing is or what resources you have. But it's possible. I think what I more commonly see this with Canadians. By and large, that's the most common I see it with. And it's fine. We can file and bring you back on an H at any time. There's not a huge challenge. One thing, which seems odd, but they actually challenge, because you have to be in your country of legal permanent residency, that you've been in that country. So often you'll want pay stubs, tax returns. I've even had clients take pictures of themselves every day for 2 years to prove they were in their country of legal permanent residence. Because they may say, well, sure, you left the US, but your legal country of permanent residence was France, and maybe you spent the entire time in London. We don't know. So you're going to want to have, in that scenario, proof that you were actually in France, not in the UK. You're allowed to if you follow a non-traditional pathway into 2 years of general psychology fellowship, and then end with 1 year of general psych. So this happens all the time. Generally for waiver programs and an H, not a problem. If you do your fellowship first, we have this with foreign physicians. They do their fellowship first and then their residency later. Common, not an issue. Do you mention your spouse isn't in permission to work if I'm on a J1 waiver? So yeah, so that's correct. So this is one thing that often comes as a shock to people is during your J1 residency or fellowship, J2s are generally allowed to work and apply for an EAD. Well, what happens when they go to their attending or they become their waiver job after they graduate is generally H4s are not allowed to work. Now you can offset this often by filing a PNIW as early as you can in the process. And then once you have that I-140 approved, your spouse can then apply for an H4 EAD. So Are job changes allowed after filing the PNIW? Yes, you have to file an amended PNIW, and the new job has to be in a medically underserved area. But your new employer doesn't have to do anything else, and you can do that all by yourself. So that's one of the other advantages of PNIW. If you're on PERM, then we kind of go from there. I think I got one, maybe two more.
Right.
Just about is it assigned once I submit the I-140. How early we can apply for it? Okay, so it is depending. So it comes in two times. If you do labor certification, your priority date is assigned when you file something known as a Form 9089, which is also referred to as the PERM form. If you're doing a PNIW or an NIW or an EB1A, which we didn't even talk about, it's assigned upon the date of filing your I-140. You can generally file for it at the start of your PERM or your waiver job. So in that H-1B period. I've even done it occasionally at the end of your J-1 period. However, if you file an I-140 or a PERM, ECFMG is not going to issue you a new DS 2019. So you have to really do it at the end of your waiver, and you can't do it too much earlier. One final question from Miguel, because it's an easy one. And can two spouses necessarily need to go through J-1 waivers? Also, do you need a separate immigration attorney for the hospital, or it'll be enough? So two spouses don't necessarily need to go through separate waiver processes, but timing becomes super, super critical in those jobs, okay? Because you have to go through that whole process of filing the PNIW for one spouse earlier and then going on the other, and it can be very difficult. And you need a separate immigration attorney. You know, if money wasn't a consideration, yes, I would say go ahead and get a separate immigration attorney. Obviously, fellows and residents are not raking in the dollars. So sometimes there's a commitment. And most of the time, particularly for larger groups, you're probably going to be fine without a separate attorney. But, you know, ideally you have one, if nothing else, to look for the contract. But yeah.
Okay. Well, that's terrific. Thank you so much, Joe. We really appreciate that. Alex?
Yeah, I was just going to say one more thing about all those great questions, and thanks for all of those in the chat. Those were fantastic. We can answer a lot of these and help get you connected with answers for them. So in reaching out to us and getting connected, we can help with these questions, help get you in touch with Joe if you need that, and also just assist with your search as it relates to these questions. So thanks. These are awesome.
Thank you, everyone, for attending. This has been a fantastic, very, very informative webinar, and we hope you enjoyed it and got a lot out of it. And as Alex says, please do not hesitate to contact St. John Associates with your recruiting needs. Have a great day, everyone.